I always knew that getting married meant becoming part of another family. I expected challenges, adjustments, and the usual in-law dynamics. But what I didn't expect was to feel like an outsider in my marriage. From the moment I met Eleanor, my mother-in-law, she made it clear. I wasn't welcome. She wasn't outright cruel, no. There were no loud arguments, no dramatic confrontations, just silence, indifference, and something colder than hatred, disdain. I did. Smiling at her, asking about her day, complimenting her cooking. Every effort was met with a nod, a glance, and then nothing. No warmth, no acknowledgement, just a polite but deliberate wall that told me, you don't belong here. At first I thought I was overreacting. Maybe she just needed time to warm up to me. Maybe she was just reserved. But then, there were the moments that I couldn't ignore. Like the time I walked into the kitchen while she was having coffee with her friends. As soon as she saw me, the conversation stopped. Their eyes flickered toward me, then back to their cups. A second later, she changed the topic as if I wasn't even there, or the way she treated other women in the family so differently. Her niece, her sister-in-law, even Alex's ex-girlfriend who still showed up at family gatherings sometimes. She was warm with them, engaged, laughing. But when it came to me, a single nod, a forced smile. A silence that carried more weight than words ever could. I tried to convince myself it was just her personality, that I was imagining it, that thing would change over time. But the truth settled in slowly, like a creeping shadow. Eleanor didn't just dislike me. She resented me. The worst part, I had no idea why. Alex saw it too, but he never fully acknowledged it. He'd tell me I was overthinking, that his mom had always been difficult with people. But then why wasn't she difficult with anyone else? Then came the moment that made me realize this wasn't just about personality. This was personal. It was a dinner at their house. One of those gatherings where everyone talked over each other, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the air. I was sitting next to Eleanor, trying to be part of the conversation. And then casually, I mentioned my mother. It was subtle, instantaneous. But I saw it. Eleanor's entire demeanor changed. Her grip on her fork tightened. Her expression hardened. And for the first time in all those months, she looked at me. But it wasn't curiosity. It wasn't even irritation. It was pure, unfiltered loathing. I felt my stomach drop. Why? What had my mother done? What was it about her that made Eleanor look at me as if I'd just brought a ghost to the dinner table? I didn't say anything. I forced a smile, continued eating, pretended like I hadn't noticed. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling that Eleanor's problem with me wasn't about me at all. It was about something, someone else. Days passed, and I became obsessed with that look. I replayed it in my mind over and over, trying to dissect it, trying to find a reason. But no matter how much I analyzed, I kept coming back to the same question. What did my mother have to do with this? One night, while Alex was asleep, I took out my phone and scrolled through old pictures. Pictures of my childhood, my mother when she was younger, our family holidays. I tried to see if anything at all, connected her to Eleanor. But nothing stood out. One afternoon, I was helping clear out storage at Alex's family house. It was supposed to be a simple task, sorting through old things, packing away what wasn't needed. But then, tucked away in a drawer, half buried under old greeting cards and faded photographs, I found it. A picture. A picture that shouldn't have existed. In the photo, my mother and Eleanor stood side by side. They were smiling, laughing, like best friends, like they had a history, like they had shared something, or lost something. I felt my breath catch. My fingers tightened around the photograph. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just some forgotten friendship. This was the missing piece. I turned the photo over, my hands trembling. On the back, a date was scribbled in faded ink. A date from 30 years ago. The weight of it pressed against my chest. How? Why? And most importantly, why had neither of them ever told me? My heart pounded as I clutched the photo tighter. Eleanor had been hiding something, and somehow I was right in the middle of it. I didn't ask Alex about it. Not yet. Something was unsettling about how his mother reacted whenever I was around, but I had learned to brush it off, to pretend it didn't bother me. Until now. Until I saw how her entire body tensed at the mention of my mother. It wasn't just dislike. It was something deeper, something unresolved. The thought wouldn't leave me alone. Even when I tried to ignore it, it lingered like a shadow, following me into every conversation, every quiet moment. So when Alex asked me to help clear out some old storage boxes at his parents' house that weekend, I agreed, partly to be a good daughter-in-law, but mostly because I felt like I needed to be there. The attic smelled like dust and forgotten memories. Sunlight filtered through a small window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Alex and his father worked on moving the heavier boxes while I sifted through piles of old books, faded letters, and delicate porcelain figurines that must have been sitting there for decades. I told myself I was just organizing, that I wasn't looking for anything. And then I found it. At first, it was just a stack of photographs tucked inside a worn-out envelope, buried beneath layers of old newspaper clippings. I flipped through them absent-mindedly. Black and white images of family gatherings, blurry shots of Christmas mornings long past. And then, as I reached the last one, my breath caught in my throat. Two women stood side by side, laughing, their arms draped around each other like lifelong friends. One of them was younger, radiant, with dark wavy hair and eyes that mirrored my own. My mother. The other? Eleanor. I stared at the picture, my mind struggling to make sense of it. They weren't just acquaintances. They weren't just two people who had crossed paths. They had been close. Close enough for my mother to have once been a part of this family's memories. Why had I never known this? I turned the photo over. Faded ink, nearly illegible, marked the back. July 1993. My stomach tightened. That was 30 years ago, before I was born. Before Alex was born. How? I glanced toward Alex, who was busy flipping through an old yearbook with his dad. My hands trembled as I slipped the picture into my pocket. This wasn't the time, not yet. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind tangled in a web of questions. If my mother and Eleanor had once been friends, then what had happened? What had turned that friendship into the cold resentment I felt every time I walked into the room? I needed answers. The next morning, I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm, familiar. "Mom, did you ever know someone named Eleanor?" Silence. It stretched too long, too heavy. "Why are you asking me that?" she finally said, her voice quieter now. I swallowed hard. "Because I found a picture of you two together. You looked happy, close." Another pause. I could hear the faint rustling of papers on her end, like she was pacing or stalling. "Where did you find it?" "At Alex's house," I admitted, "in a box of old family photos." "Mom, what happened between you two?" She sighed. A long, exhausted sound, as if I had unearthed something she had spent years trying to bury. "Honey, some things are better left in the past," she said, her voice careful, measured. I sat up straighter. "So there is something." "It's complicated," she whispered. "Then explain it to me." Her silence felt like an answer in itself. "Mom," I tried again, my voice firmer this time. "Eleanor hates me. She looks at me like I've done something unforgivable, and now I find out that you two used to be friends? I need to understand why." "Let it go," she said, almost pleading now. "Please. Why won't you just tell me the truth?" "Because it won't change anything," she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know what to say to that. A part of me wanted to drop it, to believe her when she said that the past should stay buried. But another part of me, the part that had spent the past year feeling like an outsider in my own marriage, knew that wasn't an option. Because whatever happened between them wasn't just history. It was still alive, breathing, shaping the way Eleanor saw me. That night, I pulled the photograph out from my pocket and stared at it under the dim glow of my bedside lamp. The way they smiled at each other, the warmth in their eyes. And now, Eleanor could barely stand to look at me. Something had happened between them, something big. And I wasn't going to stop until I found out what it was. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something big, something that had been buried long before I was born. It wasn't just the photograph. It was the way my mother refused to talk about it, the way Eleanor looked at me with something deeper than resentment. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't overreacting. There was something real beneath the surface, something both of them had spent decades avoiding. I didn't want to wait any longer. That night, after Alex fell asleep, I reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over my mother's contact, hesitating. I knew she wouldn't want to talk about it. I knew she'd try to brush it off, just like she did before. But I also knew that if I didn't ask now, I might never have the courage to do it again. Taking a deep breath, I pressed call. The phone rang, once, twice, a third time. Each second stretched longer than it should have. I gripped the blanket tighter, bracing myself for her voicemail. Maybe she was asleep. Maybe she saw my name on the screen and decided not to answer. And then finally, the line clicked. Mom. My voice came out softer than I expected, almost unsure. There was a pause, a silence that lasted just a little too long. Then her voice, low, cautious. Is everything okay? I closed my eyes. I could hear it in her tone. She already knew why I was calling. I need to ask you something, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Another pause. She didn't ask what it was. She was waiting. I found a picture, I continued, of you and Eleanor. The silence on the other end became heavier, denser. I could feel it pressing down on me through the phone. You looked close, I said carefully. You were smiling, happy. I hesitated. What happened between you two? A sharp exhale. It wasn't quite a sigh. It was something else. A sound filled with reluctance. I told you not to bring this up, she finally said. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. A warning. I clenched my fingers into the blanket. I can't just pretend I didn't see it. Another pause, then quieter. Where did you find it? At Alex's house, I admitted. In a box of old family photos. Another sharp inhale. You went through their things? It wasn't like that, I said quickly. We were cleaning out storage, and it was just there. She didn't respond right away. I could hear the faint sound of rustling papers on her end, like she was pacing, fidgeting, stalling. Mom, I said, my voice firmer now. Why does Eleanor hate me? Silence. I pushed forward. She barely speaks to me. She looks at me like I don't belong. And now I find out that you two used to be friends? I need to know why. She sighed, a long, exhausted sound, as if she had been carrying something too heavy for too long. Some things are better left in the past. My stomach tightened. So there is something. It's complicated. Then explain it to me. Another silence. This one was different. Not hesitation, not reluctance. It was something deeper. A decision being weighed. Finally, she spoke. Not over the phone. I sat up straighter. Then I'll come see you this weekend. No, the word was sharp, immediate. A cold chill ran down my spine. Why not? She exhaled, a sound that almost resembled a quiet plea. Because once you know the truth, you can't unhear it. I gripped the phone tighter. My mouth felt dry. So it's bad. She didn't answer. I swallowed hard. Does Alex know? A pause. No. A wave of unease settled over me. I had been prepared for almost anything. Almost. But not this. If Alex didn't know, that meant whatever had happened had been locked away, buried deep. And yet somehow, I had stumbled right onto it. Will you ever tell me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Another pause. You should get some sleep. I stared at the ceiling, my chest tightening. That's not an answer. She sighed again, softer this time, tired. I love you, but please let this go. And then, before I could say anything else, the line went dead. I sat there, my phone still pressed against my ear, listening to the silence. Let it go? How was I supposed to let it go? This wasn't some meaningless argument between two old friends. This was something that had lasted for decades, something strong enough to make Eleanor look at me with pure disdain the moment I walked into a room. I looked down at the photo, still sitting on my nightstand. The woman in the picture, my mother, had no idea what was coming. No idea that 30 years later, her daughter would be sitting in the dark, piecing together a past she refused to speak of. I should have been scared. Maybe I was. But more than that, I was determined. I would find out the truth, even if no one wanted me to. I knew I wouldn't get the truth from my mother. Not now. Maybe not ever. The way she had shut down, the fear laced in her voice, it wasn't something she would just let slip. She had made her decision, but that didn't mean I had to accept it. If she wouldn't tell me, then I had to find another way. The tension between Eleanor and me had only grown thicker since that night. She barely looked at me when I visited, and when she did, it was with that same guarded stare, as if she was waiting for me to say something, waiting to see if I had figured it out yet. But I hadn't. Not completely. I had pieces, scattered and disconnected, a puzzle with too many missing parts. I found myself wandering through their house one afternoon, pretending to look for something in the hallway closet, while Alex and his father worked outside. My fingers brushed against old jackets, forgotten shoeboxes, things left untouched for years. I wasn't sure what I was searching for, only that there had to be something. Then, at the far end of the hallway, I noticed it. Eleanor's study. The door was slightly ajar, the room dimly lit by the sunlight filtering through lace curtains. I knew I shouldn't. I knew if she caught me, there would be no explaining it away, but something pulled me forward. A force stronger than reason. The room smelled like aged paper and faint traces of perfume. Shelves lined the walls filled with books, binders, and old trinkets that had long since lost their meaning. I let my hands hover over the spines of the books, my pulse steady, but my mind racing. If there were answers, they had to be here. And then I saw it. A leather-bound journal, tucked neatly between two dusty novels, almost hidden, almost forgotten. My breath caught as I pulled it free, the weight of it heavier than I expected. The cover was worn, the edges slightly frayed. I opened it slowly, my hands shaking just enough to make the pages rustle. The handwriting was neat but hurried, like someone had poured their emotions onto the page without thinking twice. The first few entries were mundane, lists, schedules, things that meant nothing. But as I flipped further, the words started to change. They became frantic, personal. Then I saw it. My mother's name. My throat tightened as I traced the ink with my fingertip. Page after page, Eleanor had written about her, about their friendship, about moments that seemed so ordinary, yet carried the weight of something much larger. And then, somewhere in the middle of it all, the shift happened. The words turned sharper, bitter. She betrayed me. I will never forgive her. She took everything. My chest ached as I read. The emotions in these pages, anger, sorrow, something close to heartbreak, were overwhelming. Whatever had happened between them, it hadn't been small. It hadn't been something time could simply erase. It had changed everything. My fingers tightened around the journal. I knew I should put it back and walk away before I got caught. But I couldn't. Not yet. Flipping further, I found an entry that made my blood run cold. If he ever finds out the truth, I will lose him. I inhaled sharply. She wasn't talking about Alex. She wasn't talking about her husband either. She was talking about someone else. My hands trembled as I pieced it together. This wasn't just about a broken friendship. This wasn't just about a falling out. This was something much deeper. There was a man involved. And suddenly I understood why my mother had told me to let it go. I heard a noise outside the door and snapped the journal shut, shoving it back into place just as footsteps approached. My heart pounded against my ribs as I turned, pretending to straighten the books on the shelf. The door creaks open. Eleanor stood there, her gaze unreadable. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, her eyes scanning the room, then settling on my hands, as if she knew exactly what I had touched. I swallowed hard. She didn't let me finish. You should be careful where you wander, she said, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. Some things are best left undisturbed. I held her gaze, refusing to look away. Like the past, a flicker of something passed through her eyes, pain, maybe, or regret. She turned, leaving the door open behind her, a silent warning. I stood there for a long time, my hands still trembling, my mind racing. I had found something, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next. I couldn't unsee the words. They were burned into my mind, looping over and over again. She took everything. I will never forgive her. If he ever finds out the truth, I will lose him. I had been looking for answers, but I hadn't expected this. A man, a secret that could destroy everything. And yet it was right there, buried in Eleanor's own handwriting, hidden away in pages she thought no one would ever read. The weight of it pressed against my chest as I tried to make sense of what I had just uncovered. It was no longer just about an old friendship gone wrong. This was about betrayal. About something so deeply personal that decades later, it still held enough power to keep Eleanor locked in resentment. I needed to know more. But I also knew that if I pushed too hard, if I asked the wrong person the wrong question, I might never get another chance. So I started where I could. I went back to the journal, every page, every entry, searching for something more. And then I found it, a name. James. It wasn't written often, but when it was, the words around it were always the same. Regret, anger, heartbreak. Whoever James was, he had been the reason everything fell apart. And I had a feeling I knew exactly who he was. I didn't ask Alex, not yet. If he didn't already know, then throwing his father's name into this mess wouldn't help. But I couldn't shake the feeling that James, his father, had been at the center of whatever happened between Eleanor and my mother. The thought made my stomach turn. If it was true, then it meant my mother had been involved with him. And if she had, then what did that mean for everything I thought I knew about her? The questions weighed on me until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to hear it from her. The drive to my mother's house felt longer than usual. The entire way, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would bring it up without scaring her into silence again. But the second I walked through the door, she looked at me. And I knew. She knew why I was here. I sat down across from her, the journal still in my bag, pressing against my side like a secret begging to be revealed. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I know about James. Her face didn't change at first, but then just for a second, I saw it. A flicker of something. Recognition, guilt, something else. She didn't deny it. I pushed forward. It was him, wasn't it? That's why Eleanor hates you. That's why she looks at me like I don't belong. Still, she said nothing. Mom, I whispered, my voice breaking. Tell me the truth. She closed her eyes for a long moment before exhaling shakily. When she looked at me again, there was something raw in her gaze. It wasn't supposed to happen, she finally said. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. Her voice was quiet, careful. James and Eleanor, their marriage was already broken. He was unhappy, so was I. She stopped, shaking her head. It wasn't love, it was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I swallowed hard. Did Eleanor know? She nodded. Not at first, but when she found out, it destroyed her. The air in my lungs felt thick. This wasn't just an affair. This was something that had shattered an entire family. I tried to piece it together to see the full picture. And Alex? He doesn't know? She shook her head. James made sure of that, and Eleanor, she never told him either. I sat back, the weight of it all settling in. My mother had been the other woman. My mother had been the reason Eleanor's life had fallen apart. And now here I was, married to her son. The irony was cruel. My mother reached across the table, her hands trembling. I never wanted you to find out like this. I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would stay in the past. But the past never stayed buried. And now it was clawing its way back to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. I stood up slowly, my thoughts a tangled mess. I need to go. She didn't stop me. The drive back home was a blur. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than they needed to, my mind running in circles. I didn't know what to do with the truth. I didn't know if I could even face Eleanor again, knowing what I knew now. No matter how much time has passed, some wounds never fully heal. And some betrayals are never truly forgiven. I hadn't planned on confronting her that night. I told myself I needed time to think, to breathe, to figure out how to move forward without tearing everything apart. But as soon as I stepped into the house, as soon as I saw her sitting there in the dim glow of the chandelier, sipping tea as if nothing had ever happened, the words were already forming in my throat. The weight of the truth of everything I had uncovered pressed down on me, demanding to be released. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. No surprise, no warmth, just the same cold indifference I had come to expect. But tonight, it felt different. Or maybe I was different. I closed the door behind me, my fingers tightening at my sides. We need to talk. Her gaze didn't waver. She set her cup down carefully, the porcelain clinking against the saucer. I assumed this was coming. Of course, she did. She had been waiting, watching, measuring every interaction, every glance, every hesitation in my voice, trying to gauge whether I had figured it out yet. Well, now she knew. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Why didn't you ever tell Alex? She inhaled slowly as if choosing her words carefully. Because some things don't need to be passed down. My jaw tightened. That wasn't your choice to make. She met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Something that almost looked like pain. And what good would it have done to tell him that his father was unfaithful? To burden him with something he could never change? I swallowed hard. I wanted to argue, to tell her that the truth mattered, that Alex deserved to know where he came from. But deep down I understood. She wasn't protecting James. She wasn't even protecting herself. She was protecting her son from a truth she thought would only bring him pain. Still, It didn't excuse what she had done to me. You never gave me a chance, I said, my voice quieter now. From the moment I walked into this house, you treated me like I was the problem. Like I didn't belong. Her expression hardened. You don't understand what it was like. Then make me understand, I shot back. She exhaled, shaking her head. You look like her. The words hit harder than I expected. I know, I said softly. You have her mannerisms, her voice, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. She closed her eyes for a brief moment as if trying to block out the memories. Every time I looked at you, I saw her, the woman who... She stopped herself, as if saying the words out loud would make them real again. I took a slow step forward, but I'm not her. Her eyes snapped to mine. No, but you are the living reminder of what she took from me. I felt the weight of those words settle between us, the years of resentment, the unspoken wounds, the belief that my very existence was an extension of a betrayal she could never forgive. A part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand that she see me for who I was, not for who she had lost. But another part of me, one I hadn't expected, felt something else. Sadness. She had carried this pain for so long, letting it fester, letting it dictate the way she saw the world. And in doing so, she had let it steal more from her than my mother ever could. I didn't know what to say. For the first time, I saw her not as the cold, distant woman who had made my life miserable, but as someone who had been deeply, irreparably hurt. And maybe that was why, despite everything, despite the anger still lingering in my chest, I found myself whispering, I never wanted to hurt you. Her breath caught for just a moment, and then just as quickly, the walls came back up. She stood, smoothing out the fabric of her dress as if that would somehow smooth out the conversation itself. I think we've said enough for tonight. I watched as she walked past me, her posture stiff, her movements controlled. But just before she disappeared down the hallway, she hesitated. She didn't turn around or look at me, but her voice was quieter than before. I don't know if I can ever forgive her, she admitted. But that doesn't mean I have to keep punishing you. And then she was gone. I let out a shaky breath, my hands still trembling at my sides. It wasn't closure. It wasn't peace. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. Alex knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into the house. The air was thick with unspoken words, the kind that linger between people who have finally said too much and yet not enough. His eyes flicked between me and his mother, searching for answers, reading the tension, the exhaustion, the weight of something shifting. I stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out at nothing. Eleanor sat in her usual chair, composed but distant, her fingers tracing the rim of a cup that had long gone cold. Neither of us spoke when he entered, but the silence was an answer in itself. He exhaled, setting his keys down, his voice careful but firm. What happened? I turned, meeting his gaze. I know the truth. A flicker of something, confusion, worry, crossed his face. He didn't ask what truth, he just waited. Eleanor's grip on the cup tightened. It's not her place to tell you. Alex's jaw clenched. He looked between us again, realization dawning too quickly, the pieces falling into place before either of us could soften the blow. He knew. Maybe not the details, but he knew. And for the first time, I saw it. He had always known something was off. Something was missing, something had been kept from him. He sat down slowly, pressing his palms together, inhaling deeply like a man bracing for impact. Tell me, Eleanor stiffened. Alex, don't. I deserve to know, he cut her off. I deserve the truth. The room felt smaller, the walls inching closer as if they, too, had been holding secrets. I hesitated, glancing at Eleanor, silently asking if she would be the one to say it. But she wouldn't. She had spent years burying it, building a life around its absence. So I spoke. It was your father. The words came out steady, though my chest ached with the weight of them. He had an affair with my mother. There it was. The truth laid bare, stripped of all the soft edges that could have made it easier to swallow. Alex blinked once, twice. The silence stretched unbearably long. I watched as the realization settled in, watched as his fingers curled into fists before slowly relaxing. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Eleanor. He just stared ahead, as if seeing something we couldn't. My father, he repeated, voice hollow. I nodded. He let out a slow, shaky breath, rubbing his face with both hands before dragging them down his jaw. And you've known? Eleanor's expression didn't change. For a long time. His head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing. And you decided never to tell me? What would that have changed? Her voice was calm, too calm. Would it have made you love him less? Would it have given you peace, knowing the man who raised you was not the man you thought he was? He clenched his jaw. I don't know, but it should have been my choice. Eleanor flinched, just slightly, but I saw it. His gaze finally shifted to me. And you? I swallowed hard. I only found out recently. His lips parted slightly like he was about to say something, but no words came. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head in disbelief. So this is why you two. It's why she hates me, I admitted. Why she's resented me from the beginning. Eleanor's eyes darkened. I don't. You do, I interrupted, my voice gentle but unwavering. You might not have realized it at first, but you've been punishing me for something I had no part in. And I understand why. The room was unbearably quiet. Alex leaned back, exhaling slowly, pressing his fingertips against his temples. I waited for anger, for frustration, for some kind of explosion that would shatter the fragile understanding we had built. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I'm not choosing between you. Both Eleanor and I looked at him. His eyes were sharp, clear, unwavering. I refuse to play that game. You're both my family. You always will be. And I won't let the past destroy that. Eleanor's posture stiffened. Alex, no. His tone was firm but not unkind. I get it, Mom. I do. You lost something, someone. And I won't pretend to understand what that did to you. But I won't let it define our future. I won't let it take anything else from us. She looked away, blinking rapidly, as if forcing back something she refused to let either of us see. His gaze softened when it landed on me. And you. I love you. Nothing changes that. But this can't be a battle. It can't be about who was right or wrong 30 years ago. It has to be about what we do now. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So what do we do? He stood, running a hand through his hair again. We moved forward. Eleanor didn't respond. She simply sat there, staring down at the cup she had never sipped from, her expression unreadable. But I saw it. The hesitation, the shift, the quiet unraveling of something she had held onto for too long. It wasn't a resolution. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. I sat across from Eleanor, the silence between us heavier than it had ever been. The room felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in, forcing us to face what neither of us had been willing to confront. The past had sat between us for too long, shaping every glance, every cold exchange, every unspoken resentment. Now, there was no turning back. She exhaled slowly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. The way she looked at me was different. Not warm, not yet, but something had shifted. The sharpness had dulled, and the ice had begun to thaw. I never wanted you to find out like this, she said finally, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. I held her gaze. But I did. She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a truth that could no longer be denied. For the first time, she didn't look like the distant, unapproachable woman who had always stood between me and belonging. She looked tired. Not in the way that came from lack of sleep, but in the way that came from carrying something for too long. I didn't know if I wanted an apology. Maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe what I really needed was to understand. Why didn't you tell Alex? I asked, my voice careful, steady. She sighed, running a hand over her face. Because I couldn't take away the version of his father that he loved. I let that sit between us. It was the same reason my mother had never told me, the same instinct to protect, to shield. But love built on half-truths had a way of crumbling, and now we were standing in the ruins, trying to figure out how to move forward. I swallowed hard. And me? She blinked, caught off guard. Why did you hate me so much? Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if the answer was right there, waiting to be spoken, but something held it back. Then after a long moment she said, because I saw her in you. I knew it, but hearing it still stung. She continued, her voice slow, measured. I spent years telling myself I had moved on, that I had built a life beyond the betrayal. But when you walked into this house, smiling like she used to, carrying the same softness, the same presence. She broke off, shaking her head. It was like losing all over again. My chest tightened. I know it wasn't fair, she admitted, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. You were never her. But I couldn't separate the two. The weight of her words settled over me. I had spent so long feeling rejected, feeling like no matter what I did, she would never accept me. And now I understand why. It had never been about me at all. I let out a slow breath, choosing my next words carefully. I didn't take anything from you, Eleanor. She flinched, just slightly. I wasn't there. I wasn't the one who hurt you. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. I know. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. Not just pain, not just grief, but something close to understanding. I reached into my bag and pulled out the journal, the same one that had started all of this. I placed it on the table between us, my fingers lingering over the worn leather for just a second before sliding it toward her. Her eyes flickered to it, her breath hitching slightly. I read it, I said softly. Her hands hovered over the cover but didn't touch it. I know what you lost. I know how much it hurt you. She finally looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own life. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. Some wounds never fully heal. Some betrayals are never truly forgiven. But in that moment, we both understood that maybe, just maybe, we didn't have to keep living in the past. I stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapping around me like a quiet reminder that everything had changed. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer pressed down on me the way it had before. It had been unearthed, exposed to the light, leaving behind only the truth, and whatever we chose to do with it. Alex stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, staring into the distance. He had been quiet since the conversation ended, absorbing the reality of what had been hidden from him for so long. I watched as his shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath before he turned to face me. She's not the same woman I thought she was, he admitted, his voice low. I understood. It was the same way I had felt about my mother, about everything I had uncovered. When the people we love turn out to be flawed, when their choices reveal a side of them we never imagined, it shifts something in us. You don't have to love her any less, I said gently. Knowing the truth doesn't erase the good, it just makes them human. His lips pressed together, his eyes searching mine. And you? I hesitated. There was no simple answer. Eleanor had spent years making me feel like an outsider, punishing me for something I had no control over. But I had seen something different in her today, a woman who had carried too much pain for too long. I don't know, I admitted honestly. But I don't want to live in the past. He nodded, understanding. The door behind us creaked open, and Eleanor stepped onto the porch. The tension between us had shifted, no longer sharp but still present, lingering in the unspoken words neither of us knew how to say. She looked at Alex first, then at me, her expression softer than it had ever been. I know I can't change the way things happened, she said after a long pause, but I can try to do better. I studied her face, the exhaustion, the guarded hope. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request for forgiveness. But it was something. Alex reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, grounding me in the present. I thought about the years ahead, about the family we were building, the love that had withstood so much already. Holding on to resentment would only make us prisoners of a story that wasn't ours to carry. I think that's a good place to start, I finally said. Eleanor gave a small nod, her lips pressing together as she blinked away whatever emotion she refused to let us see. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back inside. Alex squeezed my hand. Are you okay? I exhaled, the tension in my chest loosening. Yeah, I think I am. We stood there for a while, neither of us speaking, just letting the silence settle. The past would always be there, but it didn't have to define us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Sometimes the hardest part of moving forward isn't the truth itself, but learning how to live with it. We don't get to change the past, but we do get to decide what we carry with us and what we leave behind. Healing doesn't always come in the form of apologies or perfect resolutions. It comes in the quiet moments when we choose to let go, to understand, and to create something new despite the pain. What about you? Have you ever had to confront a past that wasn't yours to begin with? Have you had to find peace in places where there were only questions? I'd love to hear your thoughts and your stories, because sometimes sharing our experiences is the first step to understanding them. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for taking this journey with me. Until next time, take care and keep moving forward.